for the protection of the translators who can incur hearing injuries from the microphone. Today we have appearing all virtually James Bezin, Professor of Technology and Policy Research. No, he's not. Oh, yeah.
He's the one who's not here.
Okay. We have Morgan Frank, Professor, Department of Informatics and Network Systems, University of Pittsburgh, by video conference. We have Fenwick McKelvey, Associate Professor, Information and Communication Technology, Policy, Concordia University, by video conference. We only have two.
Yeah, we'll go now.
Okay, with that, we will provide a 5-minute opening statement by beginning with Mr. Frank. Mr. Frank, you have 5 minutes for an opening statement, please.
Okay, thank you very much for this opportunity to share my thoughts with all of you. Generative AI renews concerns for job stability, education, and the future of work because generative AI is capable of things that were unimaginable from AI systems just 10 years ago. The conventional wisdom from labor economics recognizes that technology does not automate occupations wholesale, but instead automates specific activities within a job. The challenge is that workplace activities and AI applications vary across the entire economy, and therefore efforts to predict automation and job stability need to rely on simplifying heuristics. Cognitive, creative, and white-collar workers are assumed to be safe from automation, for example, because creativity is difficult to assess objectively, and because the creative process is difficult to describe algorithmically. But generative AI, including tools like large language models like ChatGPT and image generators like Midjourney, are doing creative work when they write essays, poetry, or computer programming code, or when they generate novel images from just a prompt. This means that today's AI shatters the conventional wisdom that have been used to inform economic policy and economic research. For example, unlike past automation studies, a recent report from OpenAI and the University of Pennsylvania found that US occupations with the most exposure to large language models tended to be the occupations requiring the most education and earning the highest wages. Departing from a heuristic-based approach to predicting automation will require some new data that reflects the more direct implications of generative AI. However, just like past technologies, generative AI performs specific workplace activities, which means that AI's most direct impact on occupations is through a shift in workers' skills and activities towards other skills that would complement AI. However, if workers fail to adapt, then a job separation can occur. These separations include workers quitting or being fired by their employer. Job separations will lead workers to seek new employment, but if they struggle to find a job, then they may receive unemployment benefits to support them while they continue job seeking. This lays out a pipeline of AI impact that identifies the most and least direct implications from AI and highlight that data that better reflects shifting skill demands, job separations by region or industry or occupation, and even data on the unemployment risk experienced by occupations across the economy will improve efforts to predict AI's impact on workers. There are some emergent data sources, including job postings, workers' resumes, and data from unemployment insurance offices that offer some new options for describing these details in the labor market, but are often missed by traditional government labor statistics. Finally, because shifts in skills are the most direct consequence from exposure to generative AI, prudent policy should focus on the mechanisms for skill acquisition. If generative AI will mostly impact white-collar jobs, then we should focus on the skills taught during a college education, since a college education is the typical mechanism for getting students into those white-collar jobs. But while labor statistics abound, insight into college skills are more difficult to find. If college skills are quantified, then just as we study generative AI in the workforce, we can also assess the colleges, students, and major areas of study with the greatest exposure to AI. However, educational exposure to generative AI should not be shied away from. Recent case studies find that generative AI tools do not outcompete or significantly improve the performance of experts, but they do make a big difference in raising the performance of non-experts to be more comparable to that of the experts in those applications. If this observation holds across contexts, then incorporating generative AI into learning curricula has the potential to improve learning objectives, especially for underperforming students, and therefore could strengthen educational programs. In summary, generative AI is new and exciting and will impact the workforce in new ways from previous technology. In fact, generative AI shatters the conventional wisdom used to predict automation from AI in the past because it does the work of occupations that were previously thought to be immune to automation. A better path forward would focus on the data and insights reflecting what AI can actually do from the perspective of workplace skills and activities, as well as the sources of those skills among workers in the workforce. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frank. We'll now go to Mr. McKelvey for 5 minutes. Mr. McKelvey, please.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak here today. I'm an associate professor in information and communication technology policy at Concordia University. My research addresses the intersection of algorithms and AI in relation to technology policy. I submit these comments today in my professional capacity, representing my views alone. I'm speaking from the unceded Indigenous lands of Tiohtià:ke or Montreal. The Kainai Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and water on which we gather today. I want to begin by connecting this study to the broader legislative agenda, then provide some specific comments about the connections between foundational models trained off public data or other large data sets and the growing concentration in the AI industry. Canada is presently undergoing major changes to its federal data and privacy law, C-27, that grants greater exemptions for data collection as classified as legitimate business purposes. These exemptions enable greater use of machine learning and other data-dependent classes of AI technologies, putting tremendous pressure on the late amendment, the Artificial Intelligence and Data Act, to mitigate high-risk applications and plausible harms. Labor, automation, workers' privacy, and data rights should be important considerations for this bill, as seen in the U.S. AI executive order. I encourage this committee to study the effects of C-27 on workplace privacy and the consequences of a more permissive data environment. As for the relationship between labor and artificial intelligence, I wish to make 3 major observations based on my review of the literature and a few recommendations. First, AI will affect the labor force, and these effects will be unevenly distributed. AI's effects are not simply about automation, but about the quality of work, and that the current arrangement of AI is concentrating power in a few technology firms. I grew up in St. John, New Brunswick, under the shadow of global supply chains and a changing workforce. My friends all worked in call centers. Now these same jobs will be automated by chatbots, or at least assisted through generative AI. My own research has shown that a driving theme in discussing AI in the telecommunication services focuses on automating customer contact. I begin with call centers because, as we know through the work of Dr. Enda Brophy, that work is female, precarious, and mobile. The example serves as an important reminder that AI's effects may further marginalize workers targeted for automation. AI's effects seem to already be affecting precarious outsourced workers, according to reporting from the rest of the world. Understanding the intersectional effects of AI is critical to understanding how its impacts will be on the workforce. And we are only beginning to know how Canada will fit into these global shifts, how Canada might export more precarious jobs abroad, as well as find new sources of job growth across its regions and sectors. Finally, workers are increasingly finding themselves subjected to algorithmic management. Combined with a growing turn towards workplace surveillance as being studied by Dr. Adam Molnar, there is an urgent need to understand and protect workers from invasive data gathering that might reduce their workplace autonomy or even train less skilled workers or automated replacements. According to the OECD, workers subjected to algorithmic management have a larger reported feeling of a loss of autonomy. All the promises of AI hinge on being able to do work more efficiently. But who benefits from this efficiency? OECD studies have found that AI may also lead, and I quote, to a higher pace and intensity of work. The impact seems obvious and well established by past studies of technology like the BlackBerry that shifted workplace expectations and encouraged an always-on expectation of the worker. Other research suggests that AI has the biggest benefits for new employees. The presumed benefit is that this enables workers to make a contribution more quickly, but the risk is that AI contributes to devaluing or deskilling of workers. These emphasize the need to consider AI's effects not just on jobs, but on the quality of work itself. The introduction of generative AI marks a change in how important Office suites like Microsoft Office, Google Docs, and Adobe Creative Cloud function in the workplace. My final comment here is less about AI's particular configuration now, as we're seeing, but instead seeing a growing reliance on a few technology platforms that have become critical infrastructure for workplace productivity that are rapidly integrating generative AI functions. AI might lock in these firms' markets' power as their access to data and cloud computing make it difficult to compete, as well as for workers to opt out of these products and services. Past examples demonstrate that communication technology favors monopolies without open standards or efforts to decentralize power. I'm happy to discuss remedies and solutions in the question and answer period, but I encourage the committee to, one, investigate better protection of workers and workers' rights, including greater data protection and safeguards and enforcement against invasive workplace surveillance, especially to ensure workers can't train themselves out of a job. Two, consider arbitration and greater support and bargaining power, especially for contracts between independent contractors and large technology firms. And three, ensure efficiency benefits are fairly distributed, such as considering a 4-day work week, raising minimum wage, and ensuring a right to disconnect. Thank you for the time and opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Mr. McKelvey. We'll now begin the first round of questioning with Madame Ferrari for 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses that are here today to discuss the impacts of AI, in particular on labor, but where Canada sits on this. Mr. Frank, if I can, are you Canadian? I know you're working out of an American university, but are you Canadian?
I'm not Canadian, no. I'm American.
So what do you know about Canada's current productivity in terms of AI and where we stand?
So I know that Canada is very active in innovating in this space, mostly through my exposure to academic activity in the area of machine learning and computer science and data science as well.
Canada is actually 29th out of 38 countries in the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development based on GDP per hour worked, to the lowest rates of new technology adoption in our private sector. So we're actually doing really poorly in this area. We're really behind, and our production and our productivity in the last 8 years has really plummeted as well. And it says that out of 35 OECD countries whose national statistical agencies have conducted similar business surveys, Canada ranks 20th in AI adoption, so 20th out of 35. But you had some really interesting points that I think you were talking on, and I'd like you to expand on them, because you talked about the creative ability of AI, and in particular, you said something about not being immune to automation. What do you mean by that?
Sure. So what I mean is that because the nature of workplace activities or the skills you would need to perform one job compared to another are so particular and so diverse, it's been difficult to find data that reflects all this variability. And so researchers have relied on just heuristics. For example, if you get a college degree, you don't have to worry about automation. But what's interesting about generative AI is it's doing work that would have been assumed to be safe from automation just a few years ago. And so that means that there are new parts of the economy, in particular, high-skilled, white-collar jobs, where generative AI is doing some of the workplace activities we would expect from these workers, and that is something new.
So where do you see closing the gap that the employee learns how to operate AI rather than being replaced by AI?
Yeah, so this is a very good question. I think that it's not exactly clear exactly how to incentivize this among employers. I think workers recognize that they need to upskill to work with whatever the new technology is in their domain. But I feel that employers and HR, they don't make enough space for this, or they don't see the value. What's a lot more common just generally is sometimes it's easier to separate with a worker who's been with you for a while and has a higher wage when you can hire somebody out of college for much cheaper who's just entering the workforce and is already prepared to work with new technology. So exactly how to do this reskilling on the fly for folks who are already in the middle of their careers is an open question.
Thank you for that. And just as somebody who's sitting on sort of the other side of the border looking in at Canada, how do you think we're doing on a productivity level? I know I gave you some stats, but what is the general consensus, or is that something that's talked about amongst your peers and colleagues?
Yeah. So what I see is that, like I mentioned, the research activity around AI in Canada is very strong. And so I feel that they're given the statistics that you pointed out, that there could be an improvement in capturing some of that talent in the economics of Canada. My understanding is that there are tech companies that are interested in places like Vancouver, for example, but this population of companies and workers is far outstriped by areas in the US, including in New York and in Silicon Valley outside San Francisco. So maybe that type of critical mass hasn't quite found a home in Canada yet.
You just touched on a very critical point. So we have the potential to attract the talent, to attract the work, to increase our GDP. But there's barriers in place of what brings people to Canada. And I don't know if you want to expand on that, but I'm curious if you've heard about our housing crisis, of our inflation, of these kinds of issues that you're seeing in the state, that you're hearing about.
Yeah, I don't have too much to say about that, although we have many of the same issues in the US too.
Thank you for that. And if I can go over to Mr. Fenwick. Mr. Fenwick, your testimony seemed very almost anti-AI. It seemed like you were, even when I see what you've published, one of your papers, Internet Demons, Digital Communications Possessed, it seems like you have more of a negative spin on something that can be used as a tool, and it is important, as I say, the horse is out of the barn. How do we use this to our benefit rather than being afraid of something that is inevitable?
I would say that I don't have a negative view of artificial intelligence. What I would say is that I'm cautious, and I think my responsibility is to identify gaps between the development and deployment of artificial intelligence in the current regulatory environment in Canada, and particularly some of the ways that we're talking about how Canada fits into a global political economy around artificial intelligence. I think some of my concerns around specifically generative AI hinge upon its impacts and relationship to Canadian privacy law. And I think that what we've seen, and I think what's quite significant, is that we're undergoing kind of a classic procurement hack, which is that technology like ChatGPT has been released to the public, and that workers are adopting and scrambling this without actual adequate time to address how this is being integrated in the workforce. This is a similar strategy that's been used by companies like Clearview AI in trying to adapt the use of AI tools in police forces through a kind of similar mechanism of circumventing classic procurement mechanisms. And I think that these types of strategies are part of what I hope to call out, less concern necessarily about the technology itself, than about its kind of delivery and development with a clear sense of its social impacts.
Just to correct, I'm sorry, I think I called you Mr. Fenwick, and it's Mr. McKelvey, or McKelvey, sorry. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Madame Ferrari. Mr. Coteau for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank our witnesses for joining us today. It's pretty exciting to hear from experts on this very interesting subject matter. So thank you for your time. Maybe I'll start with Mr. Frank. You suggested that generative AI may impact white-collar workers more than what traditionally referred to as blue-collar workers, and I'm assuming automation would affect white-collar workers less than AI is. Can you explain a little bit more about how those two technologies, and I know this is a study on AI, but I think it's important because I guess the second part to the question is, how is the integration or the intersection between those two technologies going to impact both workforce sectors?
Yeah, sure. So to elaborate, yes, workers across the economy in white collar roles or blue collar roles can face the threat of automation from technology, although usually the technologies are really quite different. So the go-to example for blue-collar workers might be thinking about robotics in manufacturing, while until recently, the example for white-collar workers was to think about things like computer programming, machine learning, and it seems that blue-collar workers are at greater risk from being completely substituted by things like robotics. Like imagine a conveyor belt with a robot arm completely replacing somebody who would otherwise have to move things around, while white-collar workers are made more productive because machine learning makes it easier to analyze data and focus more on interpreting results rather than actually crunching numbers. So generative AI is different because it seems that it's doing actually the more cognitive part of that white collar work. It's actually able to interpret results in addition to things that standard AI like machine learning can already do, like crunch numbers. So this makes it fundamentally different and fundamentally within the domain of work that usually describes a white collar job rather than a blue collar job.
You know, you spend a lot of time in this area of study, and I'm sure that you see things that just amaze you in the workforce, things that may even catch you off guard, things that are disruptive. Can you give us an example of something that you may have seen, like in the last year, that even caught you a bit off guard in regards to the disruption it's having within a sector? Any examples?
Yeah, sure. So image generation has really picked up very quickly in just the last 2 years. It's performing very well compared to 5 years ago, and it's getting better at a faster rate, and it's generalizing into other modalities as well. So we're starting to see things like not just creating a single image based on a prompt, but creating several images together based on a prompt that are all coherent. So you could think about like a page from a comic book, for example, and even creating whole videos based on descriptions of the features of the objects in the image and also how they're going to interact over time. So this is just really a space with a lot of expansion. And this has created a lot of uncertainty for creative workers in the economy. So the most obvious example is with tools like Midjourney or OpenAI's DALL-E, which are image generator platforms. What do these tools mean for the future of work for graphic designers? It seems that there's a risk that graphic designers could be completely automated, but I actually don't think that that's what will happen. What I expect is that these tools will make ideation, which is just one step in the creative process, much faster and much more scalable. And so graphic designers will become more efficient. Maybe they can offer their services for a lower price per contract because they're able to do this ideation so much faster. And from the economics literature, we know that when there's this scaling in productivity, the scaling of demand doesn't always have to be linear. It's sometimes the case that you can get more demand as a good or product becomes easier to produce.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that response. Mr. McKelvey, just a quick question over to you. You talked about protecting workers' rights or just protecting workers in general when it comes to the adoption of AI into as it's integrated more and more into the space that workers operate within. How do we, as policymakers, as folks who build regulation, how do we develop policy regulation legislation that keeps up with changes that are happening so quickly that even in your space and your expertise, I would say that you probably couldn't predict with accuracy what's going to happen even next year. How do we get ahead of it by making sure that the policy legislation regulations we put in place actually are aligned with where we're going? Any thoughts on that when it comes to workers' rights?
Honorable member, I can assure you that I can't predict what will happen next nor when the light will go out in my office. I will tell you that I think that there is actually long-term trends. I feel as though one of the things which is important to recognize is that generative AI is arriving in a pretty well-established policy context. When you have a few large, when you do have a growing debate and concerns across the government about the influence of large technology firms. And I think really there's two things that that come to mind as key points. One has been an approach the government elsewhere has been trying to look at around arbitration and being able to like allow for and support collective bargaining power when there's such asymmetry between a large platform and a worker on those platforms, which I would add, like many of the creative sectors working online now are front and center on the kind of the impacts of algorithms and how that's going to impact content creation. And so I would think that one part is trying to figure out how to in places step in to alleviate bargaining asymmetries. The second is trying to deal with the actually the contracts and contract law, because you're dealing with, in many ways, service arrangements with large institutions and cloud providers in ways that this is really another kind of key point where there's asymmetries in place. And so I think that those are kind of two key sites of identification. And then the third thing is, I think, also just being mindful of the changes that are taking place in workplace surveillance. This is a longstanding trend, and certainly the turn towards algorithmic management and employee monitoring programs, I think, are things that also I think are not going away, and I think are things that could dedicate sustained attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Coteau. Madame Chabot, pour 6 minutes.
Madame Chabot, for 6 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses. My first question will be for Mr. McKelvey. I was happy last week that in Quebec there was a major forum on the issue of artificial intelligence, where there were many stakeholders present. And even if we're lacking some data, we are starting to see some studies about the impact, and it's becoming interesting. So I point that out to you. You spoke during your comments about C27. That, of course, is going to be studying, or it's not studied at this committee here, it's studied by another committee. And currently, I'm told that in terms of that study, we're only at the stage of talking about data protection, and we're not actually talking about the issue of artificial intelligence yet. So you've made us aware of the fact that HUMA could study the effects of C27. So in your opinion, rather, should we do that? And not perhaps one after another, or should we be doing this together? What would the impact be of looking at the impact of C27? Could you expand on that, please?
Yeah, firstly, I'd also say that some of my comments were also drawn from the Forum for IA's presentation in Montreal around some of the panel discussion around labor. So I actually think that it's important to recognize the differences in Quebec's, I think, leadership on addressing the social impacts of artificial intelligence. I think that was an important milestone in trying to push, I think, an agenda of trying to think about AI as not simply economic policy, but also as a social policy. I would think that the challenge presently with C27 is that it's complex enough itself, and then there's an added ADA amendment. And it's a really challenging moment to make a very important legislation work. And so I actually think that the more eyes on it, and particularly attention from your committee on the labor impacts of C27, I think would be welcomed. And I think given the time that committee will have to investigate the multitude of changes, I don't think is going to be enough time in the committee to address those effectively. And I think that this is an important way of coordinating AI policy across the government, which in my own research I found lacking.
Merci.
Thank you. That's a very good point. In terms of labor, you mentioned 3 things. It could have an impact that won't be evenly distributed. But in terms of the quality of work, this is of great interest to me because my Conservative colleague was talking about productivity. and I don't know where we were in the rankings, but for me, productivity isn't just the number of hours that you put in to produce. It's the quality of the work that is important as well. So in terms of quality of work, what issues do you see with the application of artificial intelligence?
Well, I want to first clarify that artificial intelligence is a complicated term presently, and I appreciate Dr. Frank's work in distinguishing between the present discussions of generative AI and the broader term what we use for artificial intelligence. And I think certainly there's a wholesale conversation about artificial AI's impact. But I think particularly in this moment right now, what we're talking about is generative AI. And I think that the two parts that stand out to me is that one, Canada's position, at least in the generative AI landscape, is different than its position in the broader AI ecosystem, in where you've really seen movement from a few large American firms to really be launching some of that, some of the kind of main products. I'm thinking here about ChatGPT and the other ones, which I think is not necessarily part of the Canadian ecosystem. And so that, I think, raises a kind of first question about where do we fit in our own kind of workplace autonomy, what tools are we able to use, and how much are we kind of following? And I think that that's an important shift. The second thing is that my background is largely in studying media systems. So I'm looking, and my closest proxy to understanding the distributed effects of artificial intelligence is looking at creators online and looking around platform regulation. And I would say that where a lot of the impacts of artificial intelligence are being proposed is around automated ad generation. Facebook is launching a new features to auto-generate AI in ads. And so I think that that actually speaks to the fact that a lot of the content is, we're talking about this kind of high-level creative stuff. And I think the kind of daily churn of information production is an important place where this impact is going to take place. And I think partially our information systems are really primed for, high volume, low quality content. And that's been a, kind of a wide concern. And that's certainly one of the kind of impacts that we have on journalism presently, is that you see workers kind of, attuned to generating press and stories for the algorithm. So I think my kind of first concern is one where you can see a kind of devaluing of the type of labor that's being done because it can be done quicker or more efficiently. And then the second in my comments is that I do think, and this is from my read of the OECD literature, is that there is also this potential of a de-skilling, or saying that we are automating this and that enables certain types of tasks. And I think that's specifically the generative AI, and specifically the generative AI that's being kind of approached from a top-down way where it's being embedded in key productivity suites and being kind of rolled out with the expectation that people are figuring out how to use it. And I think that that's an important point to make, is that how OpenAI has launched ChatGPT has been deliberately trying to kind of hack and disrupt the workplace. And that open demo that is what was ChatGPT, I think really kind of demonstrates, that is a business strategy that we want to attend to.
Merci, Dr. McKelvey. Merci, Madame Shabat. Madame Zarillo, for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the witnesses. And I'm going to ask my question initially to Mr. McKelvey. So we're obviously in the very early stages of this as legislators, and I'm sure that it's going to evolve over time. So right now I'm really wanting to focus on the obvious traps that we should be legislating. So I really appreciate the three you brought forward. I'm interested in you expanding a little bit more on this efficiency of benefits, fairly distributed, with the intersectional lens that you kind of brought to this discussion, which is gender. There could be other intersections. Of course, this committee looks at disability inclusion, so I'm also very interested in how that would benefit or harm persons with disabilities and bring them into the workforce. So on that lens, I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit how workers can be protected and benefit from the obvious evolution.
So I would say that I do want to acknowledge that there's opportunities here, and that one of the parts that I think is important with generative AI and these opportunities is thinking about how they're changing the barriers to access. And particularly when it comes to like, passing as a native English speaker, I think that, if we're adapting it kind of trying to understand these kind of multiple layers, I think one part is trying to acknowledge what are the potential benefits and recognizing that some of the kind of proxies we have for, workplace competency, like, English as, English writing is something that might ultimately be beneficial in allowing people who are non-native speakers to actually access those skills. That kind of goes back to kind of grammar. I think that part of what we're looking at here is attending to the different, there's two parts that I think that coming up is one, dealing with changing precarious workforce when you're talking about more contract work, shift work, gig work, and I think that AI doesn't change that, but I think AI adds to the kind of importance of studying the shifts in the labor market towards more kind of user platform arrangements like we see with Uber. And that's really where I feel like that's going to be one potential point of impact, is whether you're going to see AI as part of what we call algorithmic management of those platforms. And, those are often people kind of turning to those as, jobs of last resort or jobs that they're looking to. So I think in one sense that there's an important way of protecting workers who are in those kind of gig jobs. And then I think the second then is trying to look at the way that, more broadly, we have this societal arrangement with, kind of a few large technology firms that are providing kind of critical infrastructure, and how conscious they are of actually, understanding what is the way that their data collection practices and the ways that they're affecting the workforce might be in place. I mean, I think that those are kind of my best guesses of remarks. I think there is a challenge here about really this kind of deeper question about, is the driving force of this kind of productivity, is this going to be something, where is it going to be adopted and where are the kind of drivers here? And I think that part of what I see is that generative AI is incentivizing further automation in places that already seem automatable, like in, content creation. So there is, I think, a way of saying that jobs that have already been kind of de-skilled or marginalized are going to be exacerbated by the kind of turn towards generative AI.
And thank you for that. And I was just hoping to get a little bit further look into your comments around a gender split and how we need to look at this data, and also for disability. Has there been conversations around data, how data needs to be split? Has there been conversations around the disproportionate amount of data that's already in these larger systems that didn't look at women's voices, that didn't look at racialized voices, that didn't look at disability voices at the same percentage or degree?
Yeah, I think to me, and I tried in my preparations for this, I was trying to look for kind of evidence of where these impacts will be coming from, but I wasn't able to kind of find anything that's been published that's talking about the impacts in Canada necessarily with the gender base. I would say, and I'd add, this is really an important part of what's going on in these discussions about artificial intelligence, especially generative models, is the biases that embed and reproduce. And I would like to acknowledge that when you're talking about what voices, it's also important to recognize what voices these systems reproduce. There's really fantastic work looking at when you look for and ask for a generative AI model to depict a doctor, that's more likely to be a male than a female. That's the same thing that also comes down with what depicting, if you describe someone from a different country, how do they reproduce certain key stereotypes? So I think one part that to add to what I clearly agree with you is a need to kind of identify how automation and generative AI will impact jobs from an intersectional framework. I think that's clear investigative work, clear work that needs to be done. I'd also say that there's also clear concern about the biases built in and baked into these technologies that are being rolled out as solutions to workplace productivity.
Okay. Thank you so much. So I know this is going to be a long conversation over time. So I wanted to go back to protecting workers' income. So we all know that the writers were on strike, and now in the film industry, it's really impacting communities north and south of the border here. So I just want to talk about those workers, those creative workers that have already seen the impacts. And if you could share a little bit about how incomes need to be protected and how privacy and how this data collection now matters, But really, I want to know about how do we protect workers' income?
Colby?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's there's a question about ensuring that there's proper taxation, which is another discussion around large platforms about making sure they're contributing to. And I know that there's kind of some stall or move in the OECD, but I mean, certainly you're talking about ensuring that the benefits or the kind of profits that a lot of these kind of key platforms aren't leaving Canada. I mean, I think that's part of this, ensuring that there's a strong social safety network to support workers in general, whether that requires an expansion of like minimum wage. I mean, there's lots of discussion. It's a bit hard because it's so fraught, but when you're talking about, you know, uh, universal basic income, that's often kind of trotted out. Often, I think at times to kind of undermine like the need to have actually strong worker protections. So I think that there's a host of things that can be in place. I'd say that the one thing is that I've heard from creators and open up some productive dialogues, and there is concern there. There's definitely concern in the creative sector about what's taking place around generative AI, and I think it kind of demonstrates to me what's an important arrangement here. This technology is not coming in at a neutral place. It's coming in where you're talking about large studios and creators and their relationships between them. And I think
Dr. McKelvey, if you could conclude your thought with I'm sure other questioners will get to you, but I do have to keep close to the schedule, so I will move to Mr. Aitchison and Dr. McKelvey. You can certainly conclude your thought process in response to another question. Thank you. Mr. Aitchison for 5.
Well, I have a couple of questions, but I'm curious to hear the rest of your thought, Mr. McKelvey, if you'd like to finish it.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the time. I just wanted to say that I think what's interesting is that in at least the writers' strike, what was being negotiated was access for data and trying to ensure that workers were able to kind of understand their place in the organization, which I think is an important thread. There was also, I think, a concern if you're talking about franchise models, about generating like the next Marvel movie, then you're talking about a type of cultural production that's really oriented towards keeping the same type of content being churned out. And I think that that's where workers were concerned that their scripts or their content would be used to train models that ultimately would either undermine their bargaining power or kind of replace them. And I think that's important only to point out the kind of context and where there's a benefit or perceived value in this kind of automated content generation. And the third thing to say, what actors are negotiating for is, and this seems like the clear split, is whether they have a right to their face and whether studios have in perpetuity the access to modify their images. That, I think, all speaks to the idea that workers need to have data rights and privacy rights. And I think the Actors Guild and the the Writers Guild have been really the one at the forefront of demonstrating what is, I think, a broad concern, not just simply in Hollywood.
Okay, thank you for that. I'm one of those people that's still sort of struggling to try to grasp what exactly the scope of AI is, I guess. But there's no question that in the last 50 years, technology has advanced and changed in kind of an exponential fashion. I'm wondering if you can give me an example of a technology from even a generation ago that had a similar kind of impact on our on labor markets, on our society, I guess, that there was this level of concern or caution or interest, I guess. And the question is for both witnesses, if you can give me an example.
Sure. So I'll start. The internet comes to mind. I don't know that it was similar in terms of concern, but certainly in terms of being ubiquitous across many domains and really reshifting the nature of many jobs, but also creating a lot of new jobs that were unimaginable before the internet. I would say the internet is a comparable example, even if the conversation at the time when the internet was young had different tones to it.
Mr. McKelvey?
I would say I'm going to give a Canadian example here, but I think the BlackBerry. To me, I think actually I remember being a worker and my bosses had the BlackBerry and were walking around and how cool they were. But that really, I think, shifted where there's an expectation of being, connected, a change in the kind of dynamic of the workflow, of the work and the pace of the work, which is what I was getting at in my comments. But I also think there's a shift in some ways, because I often feel as though, our discussion of the internet, imagine us sitting in front of a computer and thoughtful, and so much of what we've turned to is a mobile environment. And I think that really thinking about, say, the impacts of artificial intelligence and looking at Google's new camera and how it allows you to delete people from the pictures, and the debates about what and how much you should be able to do that, is a good reminder of just the way that mobile technology and mobile phones have had a really important impact on the workforce that has been studied too in Canada.
Mr. McKelvey, further to your points, the internet and certainly the BlackBerry, I guess, are two examples. I think they're both great examples. But was there a similar level of concern at the sort of dawn of those technologies about privacy rights, for example, that we're sort of discussing now with AI?
I think. I was just hearing back about, thinking back about this, is that, when we were talking about the kind of the early days of the .com boom and stuff like that, we weren't talking about the kind of same magnitude or influence of companies. And I think, if anything, we've learned, and I think that we can partially what I'm here for is that I'm trying to be more conscious about how these technologies have been rolled out in a more thoughtful way. I think when the internet was coming about, I think there was this idea that this was a connectivity. This was going to bridge digital divides. And some of those privacy concerns fell by the wayside. I think what has really become more prominent, at least with mobile technology and the ways that mobile phones are, really part of a fairly elaborate ad tracking and surveillance network, is that those concerns have become more prominent. And I think really what we're at now is that I'd hope we'd have learned from our debates and the challenges that we have now about platform governance, and know that, when I'm talking about a procurement hack with OpenAI, to me, it's the type of strategy that we've seen companies do time and time again. And that I'd hope we're better and quicker to raise concerns about privacy and concerns about users' data than we have been in the past. And I think that that's something that, at least with I give back to the BlackBerry, it was a cool gimmick, but now I have to check my email all the time because I've been trained to do it. And I'm regret some way I didn't think about that sooner.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Aitchison. Mr. Van Bynen for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Perhaps I'm starting to reflect on my age, but building on the transformation of technology that Mr. Aitchison referenced, I think about Netflix and how that's eliminated video stores. I think about Apple Music and how that's eliminated record stores and tapes. I think about how Uber has transformed the taxi business. I think about Zoom as opposed to a phone call. So the technology has changed consumer behaviors, consumer demands, and so it'll have a very dramatic impact, I think, on the labor force. My first question is for Mr. Morgan, and that is, I guess I've often been concerned that regulatory bodies regulate through the rearview mirror as opposed through the windshield is where we should be focusing our attention. But that draws the dilemma of what can we predict with a reasonable degree of certainty and what can we not predict?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question of predicting how emergent technologies will look in the future. Of course, if I was very good at this, maybe I would be playing the stocks instead of here talking with all of you. So it's a bit of a mystery. You can look towards recent shifts, recent dynamics to try to predict what will come next. But I think in terms of regulating in an area where technology is so new and we're discovering new capabilities and applications, seems like every couple of weeks something new and exciting is highlighted. Maybe having voices from industry and from researchers as part of the regulatory conversation would be a good way to do that. I would recommend doing this in a way that allows these folks who are experts to share their views in sort of a protected way. So it's there's a public facing and also a private way for them to communicate with legislators. And that would give you the best opportunity to understand what's happening next and attempt to be ahead of it.
Okay. You recommended that a development of a decision framework, given the fundamental uncertainty of in being able to predict technological change. And what considerations or what principles should be part of that framework?
Sure. So I think that having expert opinions from the bodies that are developing and deploying platforms will be essential. But I think on the other hand, having folks that are informed based purely on the empirics of how these tools are getting used, which is sometimes out of the control of the developers and out of control of the companies, that's equally important. And in my view, it's very difficult to get this type of data, but there are some options that might be helpful for seeing how workers are changing their use of technology in real time, and also how employers are changing their demands around technology in real time. But this would be a departure from what I have seen from official government statistics about the workforce.
And so, like the United States, Canada is a very diverse country. Would you see a significant difference between the impact in workforces in large urban areas as compared to smaller towns or smaller communities? And what would be the factors to consider as that rolls out?
Absolutely. So if we focus on generative AI, then I expect there will be a lot of positive implications for the workers currently residing in cities. And there will be a challenge to make sure that some of that economic benefit trickles down to workers in rural areas. This is because a lot of the work from tech companies or the work with data, so the work that would both be involved in innovating generative AI technologies, but also benefiting from the tools you can build with these tools, with AI tools, those are workers that tend to be in cities. The type of access to data and to computing and to these AI services also requires a lot of infrastructure. For example, just access to high-speed internet. And that is, of course, abundant in cities, and it's better and better in rural communities, but it is not great everywhere. So this is just one basic way to see, even if the brightest minds were living in the most rural communities, there could still be infrastructural barriers in their way.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. Madame Chabot, pour 2 minutes et demi.
Madame Chabot for 2.5 minutes. I wish I had 5 minutes. Mr. McKelvey, a short question. You talked about call centers in your comments. But for myself, I've been involved with many unions, and with the telecommunications, there are realities that I wasn't aware of. If you think about Bell or Videotron or TELUS, there is a delocalization around the world for the call centers, and the working conditions are certainly not fair across the board. So I think there's a great challenge, if that's how you presented it, with generative EIA, or AI rather.
Yeah, I'll say that my expertise has been historically in the telecommunications sector. And when looking at discussions of artificial intelligence, there has been a real turn towards automation. And I thought that there would be more debate, but in my review of the literature, of trade literature, really there was a focus on automation and automation in all parts. And I think that automation in the call center with chatbots is a really immediate part of what's already taking place. And I think partially it's important to look at the voices from below and the voices that are working and have the lived impact of these AI systems on their day-to-day workplace. And that's why I think that was an important part of focusing on the call center, because I think, at least for me, that was the job of my future.
Yes, so we'll hope to have a quality future. Mr. Frank, or Morgan, rather. Mr. Frank, yes. There's something in your presentation where you talked about issues of around skills, but you also spoke about students who are struggling. And for me, it's very important to try and understand. Could that be an asset? or artificial intelligence, or is that really more of a risk, particularly for students who are struggling? Because for those students, they need to count on humans to support them, to improve their skills and help them with the problems that they're having. So I'm trying to understand how AI would play a role with those kinds of students.
Sure, that's a wonderful question. And the same type of volume of research about AI and its implications for skills in the workforce hasn't been carried out for the mechanisms by which workers get skills. So, education would be one of the major mechanisms by which people get skills before entering the workforce. But I think that AI is a tool that will really help educate students today. Just for a simple example, I'm a professor, and right now I have to field every email from every student when they have questions that need clarification from me. You can imagine that some of the clarifications that me or my teaching assistant provide, maybe having an AI tool that's available to them instantly in real time at any hour of the day could help them get an understanding. And if there's still confusion, then they could submit a question to me or their TA. The other thing is that, at least in the few studies I've seen that are actually random controlled trials where some workers have access to generative AI compared to those who do not, what we see is that generative AI's biggest effect is in bringing up non-expert performance to the level of expert performance. So if this observation holds in a variety of cases, what it could mean in the classroom is that underperforming students are able to reach the levels of high-performing students with access to these tools. And that could be a great dynamic, a great result that sort of makes everyone reach the same type of bar in higher education.
Madame Chabot. En 15 secondes, permettez-moi d'avoir un...
15 seconds? I would really love to continue this conversation. Thank you.
Madame Chabot, Madame Zarrillo, for 2.5 minutes, please.
Thank you. So I am going to kind of follow on this topic or this vein with Mr. Frank. So we've talked about for decades about intellectual property and how the intellectual property belongs to the company. It doesn't necessarily belong to the worker. It belongs to the company. And we're now having conversations about cognitive property. So a lot of the data that's already captured by large organizations came from someone's ideas, their education, their thoughts, their opinions, and it's now being monetized by someone else. So I'm very interested in how we protect workers' cognitive property, especially now in situations where we're starting to build a lot of that cognitive property in AI tools. So do you have some thoughts about how we can protect workers, Mr. Frank, when it comes to their opinions, education, skills, knowledge, talents?
Sure. I just want to make sure I understand your question, though. Do you mean protecting the IP of workers who help to build these AI algorithms, or the IP of the folks who generated data who may or may not be employed at the company that was used to train the AI algorithm?
So the first one. So I'm not necessarily seeing it as algorithms because they're just doing their job. They're answering phone calls, or they're just doing their job the way they always did. But it's now being captured in a way that it can answer in generative AI later. So it's just basically taking people's thoughts, opinions, intellectual property, cognitive property, and monetizing it. Corporations would do that. And how do we protect that for workers?
Sure. All right. I understand better. So I would say that this is not new to AI, this dynamic where the ideas, the thoughts, and the sort of perspectives of workers get encoded into AI, just as the perspectives of programmers who built social media websites gets encoded into the programming and the code behind the website. So I would say that this isn't maybe a new topic, and it's actually, I think that having workers who are thinking about these issues So, for example, representation and how do we count for different viewpoints, having those people with those ideas embedded into the engineering side of these tools is really powerful for exactly that reason. Another thought that comes to mind is that the generative AI tools that we're seeing now that are making big waves, so things like ChatGPT and Midjourney for image generations, these are not things that I could produce here with my laptop or even with the computers I have at my lab at the university. These are really things that require collaboration between smart people who can write very effective code and huge amounts of resources for the computing side, the training side of these AIs. So I don't think that something like ChatGPT would have emerged without a collaboration between smart people to do the coding and the resources that accompany